Hello guys. So we're now going to be applying our principles that we've looked at in the previous two videos on osmosis and how water can move from one plant cell to another. Remember the three ways: apoplastic, symplastic, and vacuolar. Okay, right, there's three ways that water can move between plant cells, and what we're going to look at now is essentially how the water comes into the plant and how, using those three, the idea of osmosis and the three ways that water can move between plant cells, how it gets into the root in the first place, and then from the root how it moves through the root from the outside cells of the root into the xylem, and then via the xylem to the other parts of the plant, such as the stem and then the leaves. Okay, but remember, you only need to, all of that is going to happen using those four ideas: osmosis, and then the three ways that it moves by osmosis, which is the apoplastic, symplastic, and vacuolar. Okay? So it will only ever be these things. And remember, with the osmosis, it's all about the solute concentration and about water potential. Alright? So it's just basically these ideas, but we're applying it in the context of water moving through, into the root, and then from the root into the xylem, and through the stem and to the leaves. Okay? But it will be these ideas that we will be drawing on. Okay, so let's begin. What I've got here is a diagram of the cross-section of a root. So just kind of showing you what the collection of cells might look like, and just to kind of make that point a bit more clear, I've drawn the kind of maybe the rest of the root structure. So if we had a piece of root and we sliced it and produced a cross-section of what we are looking at, this is what we would see. Okay? Now, let's have a look then. Now, why I've started with this is some of these structures are going to be very important, and I'll be referring to them, and it's going to be helpful for you to kind of have an idea of where those structures are when we are talking about them. Okay, so here is the xylem, okay, appearing as a cross in the center of the root, okay, and around, in between the crosses, this is where you'll find the phloem. All right, but this is not going to be the major part of our discussion about the movement of water, okay, because remember, the phloem is about the movement of sugars and other assimilates. It's the xylem that's responsible for movement of water mainly, and that's what we're going to be focusing on, is the xylem right here. Okay, now outside of the xylem and then the phloem, you have the other main structure that we're looking at is this one right here. All right, this purple layer of cells. The orange one doesn't really concern us too much. This purple layer is called the endodermis. Okay, endodermis. Okay, so let's just make the xylem there. So the xylem. So we're concerned with the xylem. We're concerned with the endodermis. That's that ring of cells around the xylem. Okay, and outside the endodermis, we'll also be referring to this layer, thick layer of cells. Many layers of cells, I should say, many layers of cells, and that layer of cells can be called the parenchyma, or also the cortex. Okay, so this cortex will also be referring to the cortex, and finally, so that the cortex is here, kind of yellow or beige, I don't know how it's appearing to you, but this kind of thicker layer of cells called the cortex. Okay, and outside the cortex, the outermost layer is the epidermis. Okay, epidermis. So embarrassing to trace. Anyway, we have our epidermis on the outside, right? So that's the other main layer that we'll be talking about. And some of the epidermis cells are specialized to form root hair cells. Okay? So we'll be looking at that as well, because it's the root hair cells that are specialized to have their surface area increased so that more transport of water can happen. Okay? Larger surface area. Remember the features of transport, exchange surfaces. Yeah, transport and exchange surfaces. Right, so I think I'm happy with that. Now, what I'll come back to you with a kind of modified diagram, but remember the main things that we're going to be talking about, we're going to be looking at the journey of water. It's going to be entering through the root hair cell, okay, which is part of the epidermis. And from those cells, it's going to be entering the cortex. It's going to be moving from the cortex through the endodermis, and from the endodermis, it's going to go into the xylem. All right, and that is the journey. We'll be looking at how this process is, made to happen, as it were. How is this process made more efficient and effective? Okay, you can't just rely on these things to happen by, passively. Yeah. The requirements of the plant for water are quite high. They'll be losing lots of water. So we need to kind of make sure that this process is happening efficiently, effectively. How do we make it happen in that way? We'll be looking at how that happens. Okay, but just have in your mind the main structures: root hair, cortex through the endodermis, from the endodermis into the xylem, from the xylem to other parts of the plant. Yeah, because this xylem is then a structure, tubes that go all the way from the root through the stem, all the way to the leaves. Okay? Right, I'll come back to you with another diagram and we'll go from there. Alright, I am going to take this, most of it away now. What I'll do is just leave a tiny part of this here so that we can follow the journey through of the water from outside of the root into the root, and then through the xylem to other parts of the plant. Okay, so it's coming in from there. Okay, so the blue arrows represent H2O, water. Okay, and I'll get rid of this to give me more space to discuss the detail. All right, remember what this is: cortex. Right, and there's many cells here. One layer of cells kind of sort of. Okay, so I'll get rid of this, but remember the context of what we are talking about. All right. Right, now, if you are using the same textbook that we do, I wasn't overly impressed with the explanation of this. Well, the explanation's all right, but they could have used a few more diagrams, to be honest with you. Right, so everything we need to know is still there, but we're going to look more detail now at the kind of route that will take. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a section going that way, and we're going to be looking at how water is going to be moving through a line of cells that are going to be going in that direction. Okay, so on the outermost we need to look first at how the water comes into the root hair cell in the first place. Okay, so right, cell wall and cell membrane of the root hair cell. So that's that one right there, and then it's going to be moving into the cells of the cortex, or across the cells of the cortex, or via the cells of the cortex. Remember, if it's apoplast pathway, it's not going to be going into the cells, is it? So just depends what route it's taking. Okay, so it's going to move through some cells of the cortex, and then it's going to come to the cells of the endodermis, and from the endodermis it's going to move into the xylem. And what I'll do is I'll do a very kind of naughty thing and not draw it diagrammatically, but instead show you, what the context of the whole thing is, which would be that once the water gets into the root hair cell, through the cortex cells, through the endodermis cells, then it's going to be moving into the xylem. And here I've just drawn the pits of the xylem into which the water will be moving, okay, into and upwards. Right then, so let's look now at what goes on. Right guys, welcome back. Let's begin, okay? So, we're going to be looking at, first of all, water coming into the root hair cell, okay? Now, why would it do that? Remember, it will only move if the water potential here is higher than the water potential here. And remember, what lowers water potential is having more solute present. So the more solute you have in there, the more things dissolved you have in here, the lower the water potential is going to be there. Okay? So, because this is a cell, naturally it's going to have things dissolved in it. Amino acids, sugars, sodium, chloride, potassium, things like that. They're going to be dissolved in there, so the water potential is going to be lower. So generally, water will be moving. So these could be just soil particles, but within those, in between the soil particles, you can have lots of water. Okay? And so, water tends to move in by osmosis because you've got things dissolved in here. Okay? And you want to refer to those things as mineral ions. Okay, so there's mineral ions dissolved in here, and because of that, the cytoplasm has a lower water potential than the soil, okay, or the water in the soil. But on its own, the movement of water by osmosis, because of that, is going to be too slow for the needs of the plant. So what the plant root hair cell is adapted to do is it's adapted to be able to lower its water potential even more. And the way it does that, green and red don't really show up very well on the board, so I'm just going to use blue and black if you don't mind. Okay, the way it does that is by having special proteins, well, it's going to be wrong to do it that way, on its plasma membrane, and what their job is to do is to actively transport these mineral ions into the cell. Okay, and okay, now these mineral ions, they are actively transported into the cell, i.e. we are converting ATP to ADP, i.e. we're using up energy in the process of bringing these mineral ions in, likely from a region of their lower concentration to a region of the higher concentration active transport. Okay, and some examples of mineral ions include nitrates, potassium ions, 2 plus, sodium and chloride. Okay, let's take potassium, right, fine. Okay, so these are examples of mineral ions and they are actively transported in, and as a result of this, we're going to get a further lowering of the water potential. Okay, so mineral ions, active transport. Okay, active transport, cytoplasm therefore has a lower water potential than the soil, or you can call it more negative. And as a result, water moves into root hair cell by osmosis. Okay, this is important. Right, now this is an active process. So you can imagine, you know, there's going to be, your root hair cells will have to have lots of mitochondria in there to supply enough ATP. Root hair cells also have large number of, or a high amount of stored starch. Remember, the starch is going to be broken down to provide glucose for the respiratory process, for cellular respiration to happen, to provide enough ATP. Okay, so I'll just draw that in as a kind of side note. Starch is going to be, you know, broken down to glucose. Glucose is going to go through respiration to provide ATP. Remember, glucose is not converted into ATP, it's just broken down to provide ATP. Okay, so mitochondria and starch are clues that the root hair cells require a lot of energy, and they require lots of energy because they are constantly transporting these mineral ions into the cell, and because they do that, water then moves in by osmosis into the cell, okay, from the soil. Right, so now we've got lots of water in the root hair cell. Okay, but how do we make sure that it goes in this direction? Okay, and that is what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so to continue then, so far what we've done is actively transported mineral ions into the root hair cell. That lowers the water potential of the cytoplasm of the root hair cell relative to the soil and the water in the soil, and therefore water moves in by osmosis from a high water potential to a low water potential. Now we're going to look at why that water might be directed that way by osmosis. Okay, so we're going to now move away from the root hair cell and just look briefly at these endodermis cells. So remember, we had root hair cell, we had the cortex, then we had the cortex, and then we had the endodermis. So we're looking at the endodermis now. Okay, endodermis. So this is a cell of the endodermis, and it plays a very important role. So what it does is, again, active transport is involved. What it does is it is responsible for actively moving mineral ions from the cortex, okay, from the cortex into the xylem. Okay, so some of the minerals that are kind of imported by active transport into the root hair cell might make their way into the cortex, and then from the cortex these are then moved into the xylem. So mineral ions are moving, actually no, I shouldn't use a blue arrow. The mineral ions are being moved actively with, again, the use of ATP, broken down to ADP, releasing that energy being used to drive protein shape changes that allow the movement of ions from one place, from outside the membrane to inside the membrane. Okay, so wherever there's active transport, I will highlight that with colors. Okay, so mineral ions being moved. Okay, from the cortex, once they're in the endodermis cell, they'll be moved from the endodermis cell into the xylem. Okay, and from what we've looked at before, the process of moving mineral ions, solutes, lowers the water potential in the place that they eventually get moved to. And by lowering the water potential, of course, we are drawing water by osmosis. Okay, lowering the water potential here. As we move the mineral ions here, the water potential will be lower here. Water is drawn by osmosis or moves by osmosis. As those mineral ions are then actively moved into the xylem, lower water potential here compared to the endodermis, and water is then moving by osmosis into the xylem. Okay, so by actively moving these mineral ions, we're actually guiding the movement of water to where we want it to go. Okay, so mineral ions from the cortex into the xylem. Okay. All right, and therefore, because of that, because we are lowering the water potential where we move the mineral ions, water then follows. Okay, and what I will do is just kind of, let's say, highlight that. Because of the three ways that water can move. So, okay, so we had the apoplast pathway, we have the symplast pathway through the plasmodesma, and we also might have the vacuolar pathway. Okay. Okay, right, so it's getting a little bit complicated, but if you've been following me, you know, it's been a gradual addition, so it shouldn't be too difficult, but we will recap. Okay, so active transport into the root hair cell, lowering water potential, water moves in by osmosis. Endodermis does pretty much the same thing, but it moves the mineral ions from the cortex into the xylem, lowering the water potential of the xylem compared to the cortex. Therefore, water moves from the cortex into the xylem by osmosis. And my overly complicated arrows are just there to show that water can move by the vacuolar pathway, or the symplast pathway, or the apoplast pathway. Okay? But, I made a mistake there. The endodermis cells have one final adaptation to kind of really make this process extremely efficient. Okay? Because there's many cells here, yeah, in all three dimensions. So these cells go all the way around this way, they go upwards, and they go downwards. Okay? So how do you make sure that water is actually moving in this direction really efficiently into the xylem? That's what we need to do. By doing all this, we are generally moving water in this direction, but how do we make it really efficient and make sure that it's getting into the xylem as effectively, as quickly as possible? So one final feature of the endodermal cells is a kind of waterproof layer, a waterproof strip that goes all the way around the cell in this particular in, I guess, 2 dimensions only. So this layer is like a ribbon that goes around the cell, like this. Okay? So it's just kind of wrapped around the cell that way. Okay? And it's waterproof. Okay? It's waterproof, and it's waterproof because it's got added hydrophobic materials kind of in that cellulose material. Okay? So it's kind of cellulose, but impregnated with hydrophobic molecules. And because it's got lots of hydrophobic molecules in there, it prevents water moving in this direction. It prevents water moving in that direction because it goes all the way around. It prevents water from going in that direction. And it encourages, therefore, water moving in only in that direction, i.e. into the xylem. Okay? And this thing is called the Kasparian Strip. Very important. Okay? Did I manage to get it on the board? Yep. Okay, so that's fine. So because of this Kasparian Strip then, we're preventing the movement of water, if you imagine in 3 dimensions, that way, yeah, and that way and that way. All right? Do I need another diagram? If we look at this cell in 3 dimensions, all right, something like this, okay, cell wall, right, our water is actually moving in that direction. Okay, coming from here, coming from here, right? But what we're saying is we need it to come through and move into the xylem. So we need the water to go efficiently from the cortex into the xylem. But what's preventing it from going that way? What's preventing it from going that way? What's preventing it from going that way? And even that way? How do we make the process really efficient of water going that way, i.e. cortex to xylem, and not to other endodermal cells? What we have is the Kasparian Strip. Okay, so the Kasparian Strip goes all the way around. Okay, and in that way, it stops water moving in that direction. Because it's gone all the way around, at the bottom, it stops water moving in that direction. It stops water moving on the other side that way, and it's going around the top, so it's got to stop the water going in that way. So therefore, once water enters here, because of the difference in water potential, remember, because of the active transport, we have a high water potential here and a low water potential here. Water can only move from there into the xylem. Because of the Kasparian Strip, we effectively block the apoplast pathway, i.e. the movement of water along the cell wall wherever there's the Kasparian Strip. Okay, so remember the apoplast pathway was outside, in between the cells, through the cell walls even also, but because of this Kasparian Strip, we are blocking that apoplast movement of water. Okay, so if you want to kind of formalize what we've just discussed about blocking the movement of water in certain directions, the way you do that is by saying that you are blocking the apoplast. Kasparian Strip blocks apoplast movement of water. Okay, that would be the way to do it. Okay, so now what we have is we have the complete route of water no pun intended, we have the route of water from the root hair cell all the way across the cortex, via the endodermis, and into the xylem. Okay? And we'll next talk about what happens to the water once it's in the xylem. But I hope this has been useful and explained a few things. You know, I guess you know about the theory of it. Maybe what might not be so clear from the textbook is where all this stuff is happening. Okay? So remember, you could see it like that. You could see a diagram even that shows all the individual cells. Just look out for these layers. Remember that the xylem in the root is a cross. Within the cross arms, you've got the phloem. Outside of that, you've got the endodermis. Outside of that, you've got the cortex. And outside of that, you've got the epidermis. And some of those epidermis cells will be specialized to be root hair cells to increase their surface area to absorb and exchange more mineral ions over their membranes. Alright guys, hope that's been useful. Next we will talk about what happens to water once it's in the xylem.